welcome. Just give people a few minutes to join and then we'll start introducing our guests. So it sounds like we've got quite a few attendees, so we'll just make a start. Thanks very much to everybody for attending. I'd just like to allow our speakers to introduce themselves. So would you like to start, Alistair?
So hello everyone. My name is Alistair Churchard. I'm a clinical psychologist and NIHR predoctoral fellow doing research into the topic I'm speaking about today. It's very nice to see you all here today. Thanks for coming.
And Peter?
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Peter Fury. I'm a professor of global mental health, and I'm also a cognitive behavioral psychotherapist. I'm based at Hampshire and Isle of Wight NHS Foundation Trust, and also based within the University of Southampton as well. Thank you.
Welcome, thank you. My name's Rebecca Syed Sheriff. I am a consultant psychiatrist and senior academic from the Department of Psychiatry and also work with the Chimes Group. I'm very interested in young people's mental health and the whole topics around culture and underrepresentation. So very, very excited about today. Just to talk about the webinar itself, just a bit of housekeeping. It lasts for up to 1 hour. The way it's going to be structured today is that Alistair will give his talk, which will take around half an hour. Peter will then do his response, which will be 5 to 10 minutes. We're going to save questions to the end, but there is a Q&A function. So those questions will be asked at the end. And as part of your question, you can also specify if that's a question that you're happy to for us to read out for you, or if that's something you wanted to ask yourselves, and the questions will be selected according to popularity and pertinence to the webinar, but obviously we'll get through as many of them as we can. So this webinar will be recorded and it will be publicly available on our YouTube channel, and you will be notified when it's ready to view. Please switch off cameras and mics. I've found it looks like most people's are off already, just a reminder there. Please don't use AI note takers as these aren't permitted for information security reasons. And we've been asked to remove any AI note taker software from our meetings. As I said, please post questions on the Q&A and these will be taken at the end. And the chat function is also switched on. So you can use the chat for general information, but don't use it for questions. Okay, well, that's that felt lengthy, but we're through it and ready, very ready to hear Alistair's talk. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, so thanks very much to Rebecca and Peter. I also want to say thank you to Eva, who's helped us today with the arrangement, Eva Rogers as well, and also to Professor Kambui for inviting me to give this talk in the first place. So without further ado, I'll move on. So the topic of my talk is about historical context of people from marginalised ethnic backgrounds and how that could relate to psychological therapy. But as you see, I'll go a little bit broader than that too. So I want to kind of frame this really with this quote from James Baldwin. So I won't read out all of it, but just the bits I've put in bold here about history not being primarily thinking here about the past. What we're thinking about here is history in the present, how that's meaningful for us in our present day lives, but particularly for people from minority ethnic backgrounds coming in for psychological therapy, how it might be relevant for them and how we might need to incorporate that historical context into the therapy. And I'll go deeper into that as we go further into the presentation. So the aims of what I want to do today, I want to show why historical context is important. I'm going to explore how it can be incorporated in therapy. I'm going to have a focus on CBT to give a focus to today, but the themes will hopefully apply more broadly. And they'll apply more broadly, both across therapies, I hope, but also across healthcare in general, so not just thinking about psychological therapy. I want to look for collaboration opportunities. So if something I say here today is of interest, or you want to ask a question of me or whatever, please do get in touch. I'd really welcome that. And finally, I will be covering some troubling material, so do contact me if this brings anything up. I'd be very happy to have any chats that are helpful after the event. So I want to begin with a little bit of audience interaction, because that's always helpful, isn't it? So I'm going to stop sharing this screen. I'd ask you to go to menti.com, MENTI, or you'll also see in 1 second there's a QR code you can scan. Sorry, can you... Let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen. So this is an interactive website, okay, where I'd ask you to answer this question: why might an awareness of history be important in psychological therapy with people from minority ethnic backgrounds? So you can either scan the QR code, or you can go to menti.com and enter in this vote code. And it's only short responses. And what I'd like to ask you to do is just answer. But if you see an answer up there which has resonance for you, which you agree with, type that in again. And the more people who give the same answer, the bigger that word will get. Okay? It helps us to kind of get a sense of where people are at. Okay, so lots of interesting ideas already. Okay, so understandings we got there. Trauma I can see in various ways. Power dynamics. Okay, interesting. Context, yes. Humility. Okay. In interest of time, we're not going to keep going with this too much longer. So I'd ask, we'll have a last 20, 30 seconds just to put in any additional answers you want to give. Okay, so last 10 seconds. Okay, and if you just finish writing anything there, please. Okay, so I guess what I'm seeing there is understanding's very big in the middle, isn't it? You know, we're also thinking about trauma in there. We're thinking about power dynamics. We're thinking about formulation. So that's going to speak a lot to what that's kind of not particularly surprising for me today. So I'm going to seek to kind of respond to some of those points throughout this presentation. Okay, I am going to talk about trauma, but I'm going to try to avoid an exclusive focus on trauma, because I think it's also important that we don't have a kind of trauma-saturated, problem-saturated narrative when we're thinking about a historical context. So I'll come back to that later. See, and I'd love to see what you make of this. See if you think I'm approaching trauma in the way that's appropriate for this topic. But thanks for your responses. So, locating myself, I think it's important that we're reflective and thinking about our own perspectives when talking about these topics. So this is a picture of my family, and I'm the little boy in the middle being held by the woman with the afro. As you can see, I come from a mixed race family. My grandfather, David, we always called him DAN, is the Afro-Caribbean man sitting in the middle next to my grandmother, Vera, who was a white working class woman from the north. And that personal history of coming from a minority ethnic background led to me studying history at university. I studied every single module on colonial, post-colonial history that you could do. And then I kind of forgot about it for a while, interestingly. I went off, I worked in homelessness services for a while, became a psychologist. And it was only when I was a few years into my being a qualified psychologist, that I really came back to thinking about history. And that kind of, it's been a bit of a journey for me as well, thinking about all this. And I think I just wanted to bring that so you can see my particular perspective coming from that mixed race background, but also kind of thinking about how our roots into considering this area and how to really engage with it. I'll say more about that later. So I first just want to establish why historical context is important when working with people from minoritized ethnicities. So you're showing it's not just my kind of bright idea, but there's quite a few other people who are saying this too. So the first thing I want to do here is a little bit more audience interaction. So using the chat function, who can quickly write, what is the historical event that this white client is referring to? She says, I left London for the countryside in 1940. What historical event is important? What's she talking about? Just put it in the chat quickly. Yeah, so the war, people are putting in, people are getting that very quickly. And of course, and evacuation, I can see there. So of course, that's the kind of crucial context, isn't there? She left London because I joined the Blitz. And because I knew that information, you know, that was implicit for me in what she said. It was very easy for me to ask more about her experiences of evacuation, to question, was that a terrible trauma for her, or was that actually interesting and exciting? You know, it helped me develop my understanding with her quite straightforwardly. And I should say this is someone that I actually worked with. The second client from a minoritized ethnicity said, I went to primary school in Kenya in the late 1940s. So what historical event are they referring to? Again, any ideas, just put them in the chat. What's the historical context that's important here? Okay. Let's have a look. Okay. Yeah, so various references to aspects of historical trauma. Okay. Yes, okay. So I can see there's fewer responses here, which is not surprising for me. I've asked this question a few times of people before, and I've seen a similar thing. So the important thing to know about for this particular client was that Kenya was a late colonial society which was segregated. So there was a color bar. And that turned out to be very relevant for this client's psychological development and for the formulation I built up with him. And the point I'm making here is that for this white client, I think for most therapists, it would be much more accessible, the idea of that's wartime, oh, there's something happened there, was it the Blitz? Yeah, that's probably highly relevant. But because there's less knowledge of colonial history, that means that for this other client, most therapists might struggle a little bit more to think, actually, okay, what's the relevant historical context? What do I really need to know? What should inform my questions with this person? And I would argue that makes it more of a risk that client receives a poorer service. And I just want to make really crystal clear that this isn't just about older adults. This is about people, much younger people too. So this Black British client, this is an imaginary client, but who said, I grew up in New Cross in London in the early 80s. The historical event that they might be referring to there is the New Cross fire of the early 80s. The probable act of arson, probably racially motivated, which caused the deaths of multiple young Black British people, children, and which wasn't properly investigated by the police. So a terrible act of racial trauma, which, you know, might well have a strong influence on someone as they're growing up. And I'd argue that if we don't have the knowledge of the historical context in which people from minority ethnic backgrounds are growing up, we're less equipped to ask the right questions and assessments, to develop formulations, to give them the type of support that they would most benefit from. And just some other examples of where this might be relevant. You might think of a Syrian refugee. It would probably be helpful to know a little bit about the history of the Syrian civil war, wouldn't it? Or someone growing up in West London in the late 2010s, the Grenfell Tower fire, you know, could also be a very significant event to consider. So just a few different examples there. And to show that this has been thought about already in the culturally adapted CBT literature. So Shania Rafford's the book that she led on, Cultural Adaptation of CBT for Serious Mental Illness, colonial history is listed as one cultural barrier to accessing therapy. And there are repeated brief references to history when working with various other ethnic groups. But nowhere, as far as I can see, is that developed particularly far. It's mentioned, but they're not given significant further consideration. Similarly, Sharif El-Lithi, who does a lot of work in trauma, talks about how Afro-Caribbean groups in the UK associating services with a history of police involvement in coercive hospitalization. So there's a bit of evidence there that people are thinking about history, but only giving it brief references by and large. And it also seems that this could be relevant across the healthcare system. So here, the National Institute of Health Research, their Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Toolkit, the very first section makes some explicit reference to historical context, particularly the Tuskegee study in the States as an aspect of historical context to be aware of in research. So appears to be relevant beyond psychological therapies. The Institute for Healthcare Improvement in the United States in their guidance on addressing institutional racism in healthcare organisations, the first step they suggest is to understand history. And they say that health system leaders should learn the history of racism in the US. So I hope that kind of demonstrates that there's an acknowledgement that historical context is important in healthcare with people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And just to give a fairly stark example of the impact that that might have, I'd invite you to think about vaccine hesitancy during the COVID pandemic. So this is a study which showed that historical issues of medical malpractice probably influence vaccine hesitancy among some Black communities. Okay. And I also, just because I imagine people may have questions about intersectionality, I just want to make clear that it doesn't just apply to minority ethnic communities. So we know that that other marginalized groups also have highly relevant historical context. So there's a few examples here with the LGBTQIA plus community, Section 28, how recently an openly gay MP was elected, learning disabilities, the history of institutionalization, and the kind of moves towards more legal equality. And in gender, it was only in 1992 that a rape within marriage was made illegal. So I hope some fairly clear examples of how historical context might be directly relevant with people from non-majority groups. So in summary, what I'd say here is that there are pretty authoritative sources which say that historical context is important in healthcare with people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And I hope that the clinical examples I gave there kind of maybe gave a little bit more of a sense of why that might be, you know, of how that might come out in the actual therapy room. But as far as I know, there's little sustained focus on this area. So there is the historical trauma literature, largely based in the United States, which has a very valuable focus on the ongoing impact of large-scale traumas. But I do wonder, should trauma be the principal way in which we understand minority ethnic communities' relationship to the past? Is that limiting us in some ways? Are there other ways of looking at it? Also, this, as far as I'm aware, this body of research largely based within Indigenous communities in the United States. And I wonder whether there's maybe specifics there which we might want to think about how that carries across to other communities. So I would argue that further focused research is required, and that as that research is carried out, the themes from that might apply across to other marginalized groups. So now I want to bring this down to how to incorporate historical context into CBT. I hope that kind of a specific focus on CBT kind of helps to get into the detail a little bit more, while also perhaps speaking to those broader themes. So here's a case example. I'll just give you a minute to read it. This is from a recent paper by Layla Lawton and other authors about how addressing racial trauma within a cognitive therapy for PTSD frame. I'll just give you a minute to have a look at it. Okay, and as you'll see, there's a case history here of this man Hassan, 42-year-old British Bangladeshi male, developing PTSD after witnessing his son being racially assaulted by the police. And I just want to point out to you here some aspects of potentially relevant historical context. So, in 2005, there were the 7/7 bombings, and so there an impact on Islamophobic hate crime and how that would have affected this patient. His parents emigrated to the country in 1972. So in 1972, there was a war in Bangladesh, and what's known as the Bangladeshi genocide, very significant violence, which might well have affected his parents when they emigrated to the UK. Altab Ali Park is named after Altab Ali, who was a 24-year-old British Bangladeshi murdered in a racist attack in 1978. So the name of that park evokes that racist past and present, but also community self-organization and self-empowerment, standing up for themselves. And what I'd say here is that all or none of these historical events might be important in the formulation and intervention with Hassan, but you don't know until you ask. And that's what I point out. That's what I want to start drawing attention to historical context with, saying it's something that we need to consider, but consider quite carefully about how it's incorporated into the therapeutic work. So I now want to draw that out a bit by making links to the more generic CBT literature. So this is, on the left is Ken Laidlaw, who's an older adult specialist, who's written a little bit about historical contexts in CBT with older adults. And the main thing he points out there is that if you don't take account of historical experiences, the working relationship might be affected. Specifically says, how open can a client be with a therapist? If we're thinking about Hassan, if he's not given the opportunity to explore how these historical events relate to his presenting symptoms, and he thinks they are relevant, but they're just not brought up by the therapist, how ready will he feel to share relevant information? How ready will he feel to tell the therapist what might actually be really important to him? And then Helen Kennedy, writing about the working alliance in CBT, the working relationship in CBT, emphasizes the importance of developing a shared formulation with the individual. So, and what I'd say here again is developing that shared formulation depends on the therapist being able to work with the client to get them to tell the therapist what's important to them, to express what's important to know about their background. So if that historical context is relevant to Hassan, would that, if that's not explored, there's a significant risk of a poor working relationship, and also potentially key trauma meanings aren't explored. Okay. And it might be here that questions are coming up for you about how much knowledge you need. I don't know if people will be familiar with the examples I've given already of the client who grew up in Kenya in the late 1940s, of the New Cross fire, of the background of the Bangladeshi community that I just went through. But it might be that people listening to this are having a question like thinking, oh, am I saying that you need to go away and read a lot of different books, like there's some kind of fairly overwhelming set of knowledge to take on? I'm not suggesting that. What I am saying is that some knowledge of historical facts is probably important. So if there's a community that you're working with repeatedly, a local community where you see lots of clients from that community come through the door, it's probably a good idea to learn a little bit more about their history. But there are, of course, risks with an over focus on like a specific knowledge about, oh yeah, this happened at this stage, this happened at this stage, and so on. And it can potentially lead to assumptions. It might lead to people thinking, oh yeah, so I know that this person from this particular community must have this particular history. It must have affected them in a certain way. Therefore, I need to proceed proceed accordingly. And that's obviously not really taking account of where the individual is coming from, is it? It's not really thinking, actually, what's their specific relationship with history? What's the meaning of this for them? So what I'd argue here is that this is more about a kind of a clinical skill, of a process skill of how you bring it up in the room with the person. So yeah, with coming back to Hassan, all those different events that I mentioned might be deeply relevant to work with, might be hugely important, but they might also not be. It might be that he actually says, no, that's not meaningful for me, but you don't know until you ask. So therefore, the question comes up, how do you ask? Like, what's the process skill you need here? And I think what might be helpful to think about here is the idea of meta-competence. So it's a bit of a funny word. I don't know how helpful it is as a term in terms of being immediately obvious. But basically what it means is it's the ability to be flexible with the client, to individually tailor work so that what you're doing is meaningful for them, not making assumptions, making them feel empowered. So when thinking about historical competence, historical context, and how to ask about it as a meta-competence, what I'd be thinking out there is, we have clients coming into the room with us where we have some background information, but we don't know until we ask them what's important to them. And we don't know until then to explore what it is that they particularly want to focus on. So we need to develop hypotheses, often quite quickly, about what it might be important to ask about, and then have a way to check those out. I think that's quite tricky. I think that obviously runs the risk of, making assumptions or appearing to show a certain sense of a person which doesn't actually accord with what they think and feel. So that's clearly like quite a kind of complex kind of therapeutic competency. Other related kind of aspects of how I would see this as a meta-competence is being able to validate people. So kind of being able to name stuff and show that you understand that it's important, while also not being patronizing or again, making assumptions, and ultimately working towards developing trust and shared understanding, working to build up that working relationship. So with Hassan, we might want to think about how to ask questions informed by the knowledge that that historical context might be salient, but we don't know how. And then doing that in a way which validates and which builds a sense of trust and shared understanding. Another thing that I want to emphasize is thinking about history and strengths. So I've been aware as I was putting together these slides, and I could see it in the Mentimeter earlier. Trauma is something that comes up in a big way when we're thinking about this area. And I think it's important, very important to think about historical trauma and to take account of it. But I don't think we want to get, as it were, stuck on that. We don't want to move on from it either necessarily. We want to give it full understanding and full attention, but we don't want it to be the only thing we think about. Patricia Hayes here talks about in a culturally responsive cognitive behavioural assessment, looking at strengths and supports that have a cultural connection. And many of those strengths and supports, I would argue, have a historical context to them. So examples she gives are things like artistic and cultural practices, which will have developed historically over time. You can think about how those go back into the past. Histories of community self-empowerment, like Outer Valley Park, as I mentioned earlier, that's got a history to why it was named as it was, shows the community empowering itself. But maybe a nice example is Carnival, right? A place where people can explore their histories, I was reading about in Oxford, we have Cowley Road Carnival every year. The website talks about its history grounded in African Caribbean celebration of freedom and resistance. And so the carnival in itself embodies that history, and often the carnival parades can make reference to that history. But there's also that idea it might also actually be fun. It might actually allow us to have a bit more engagement with history in a way which is maybe a bit more fluid, flexible, and which draws out its strengths, doesn't make it all about the trauma or exclusively about trauma. A few other questions I want to raise. There's many more that could be put on here, so this isn't meant to be definitive at all. But when we're thinking about incorporating historical context into CBT, I think one of the first questions is, where should it go into the formulation? If we think about the PTSD formulation, there's really only one box where historical context, historical events, like be that past acts of racism, be it something like Grenfell Tower, be it something like the Islamophobic responses after 2005 that I mentioned earlier, that could only really go into one box in that formulation, and that might be sufficient. That might be okay, but it does seem limiting in a way. It doesn't allow its full complexity to be properly explored. The same thing with the standard Beck longitudinal formulation, which has one box for early experiences. That's really the only place where historical context could go in there. So yeah, thinking about the current formulations that we have and how we make use of them to bring in this important material. A kind of broader question, CBT being focused on present, often on maintenance cycles. What do we do there about bringing in the past into that? Does it work against incorporating historical context? I don't know, but I wanted to raise it as a question, and other people like Patricia Hayes have mentioned that as a potential area. And then finally, and this goes both ways, but how to make it simple. This is Aaron Beck in 1985, encouraging therapists to simplify. And there's obviously a risk, isn't there, with thinking about historical context, that you include all this potentially relevant material, but actually it becomes hugely complex and it's difficult to actually see what the target for intervention is. So I don't think that has to be the case, but we need to think about how to keep it simple in the work. Okay, so just some initial ideas here. It's meant to be a survey, and I'd be very interested to hear what people's thoughts about what I've said. But what I want to do now, a final section, is a bit of a step change and making it a little bit more personal, because I think it's really important to also think about the personal resonances in this area, about how self-reflection as a therapist and as professionals might help us to incorporate historical context. I'm drawing particularly on James Bennett Levy here, what he's written about therapist skill development and the importance of self-reflection within that. So to show what I mean by that, here's another picture of my grandfather and grandmother when they got married. And I suppose I wanted to show this here to talk about my particular background of coming from a mixed race background, questions around belonging, my grandfather having those experiences throughout his life, and my experiences of coming back to thinking about this, particularly once I started working with a client who grew up in Kenya in the late 1940s. That's when I really began to think about my personal background and how it might relate to my professional practice, particularly because there were striking parallels with that client, with that client's background and my family background. And where that drew me to initially, or what I found myself thinking about, was historical trauma. So this is a photo taken by my uncle when he and some family members were on holiday in Ghana. And that's a photo taken in one of the slave castles in Ghana. It's a photo of the door of no return in that particular castle, which, if you don't know, is the door through which probably tens of thousands of people, enslaved people, went to the New World. So it's not unlikely that some of my ancestors went through that door to be bought by other of my ancestors. Okay. And I found myself thinking about that as I started going into this field, thinking about this personal family relationship to these acts of historical trauma, but also thinking about these things which are so long ago now. What sense do we make of the relationship to that? How do we see, as James Baldwin says, that past coming into the present? Okay. And what it brought up for me is some things I learned during my history degree. So this is Seamus Heaney. So obviously from a white background, but white Irish Catholic background, own experiences of marginalization, of not being part of a minority, of a majority group. And he writes here, it's difficult at times to repress the thought that history is about as instructive as an abattoir. And what he means by that is that history as a chronicle of violence, one thing after another, not much to be learned from it beyond that people are violent. And this was my experience when I studied history at university, when I studied colonial and post-colonial history. I'd find week after week, what I would find myself wondering is, what terrible thing happened here? What was the trauma that occurred? And I think part of my development in the last few years is trying to take account of that, but also move beyond it. Seamus Heaney, he also said in his Noble lecture, he tried to make space for the marvelous as well as for the murderous. So not just still thinking about the murderous, he says, as well as, he doesn't say instead of, but thinking about the murderous, thinking about trauma, but also thinking about the marvelous and how that might be part of our experience. And to just briefly illustrate this, here's a picture of my mum on a holiday in Trinidad after a gap of something like 30 years or something like that. And the word marvelous might be a big word. But I think what we can think about here is our ongoing relationships to history, how we can continue to make those connections, but also how we can see that those connections might lead to new discoveries, new understandings, and something that doesn't feel quite so, where trauma isn't the only thing we're thinking about. Okay. I'm going to skip over this slide, and I'm just going to come to conclusions now. So I've wanted to put across the view today that historical context is important in psychological therapy and healthcare more broadly with people from minoritized ethnicities. I hope that I've given some sense of how historical context could be incorporated into CBT. I argue, I haven't said much on this, but I think it's important that we have co-created transdisciplinary research to address the complexities that arise, that the learning from this might apply across healthcare and with other marginalized communities, LGBTQIA+, people with learning disabilities, etc. And that reflection on our personal and communal relationship with history is important. So thank you. And the last thing I'm going to put up here is I'm looking for PPI contributors. So if you know anyone who might be interested, it would be great if you could share this. But I'll pass over to Peter now, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Alistair. Yeah, please go ahead, Peter, with your response.
Well, thank you, Alistair, for that sort of powerful, personal, thought-provoking presentation. Interesting. I think it's fair to say this is timely. I think what you're stepping on really addresses a long-standing gap, in our psychological theory and practice, the omission of historical context, in particular in understanding the lived experiences of people from minoritized backgrounds. That's really, really key. And I think, my hope that really, what you've done today, provokes people to engage in a dialogue and conversation. But also, I like the way basically that you just kind of just went through and considered some of the clinical implications as well. And, if I just go back to you quoted James Baldwin, and in a way, that's really one of the central arguments is basically what he said. There is all this thing that the psychological present cannot be separated from the historical past. It's very, very important. Because this is both intuitively and empirically sound. So in a way, I think that was really key. And I think sometimes as a psychologist or as cognitive behavioral therapists, and indeed as healthcare professionals, it is very important that we let that resonate within us and really think about what does that actually mean for us. And also for many clients from Black and minoritized communities, the legacies of slavery, colonialism, state violence, if we think about even our most recent racial issues, and as well as ongoing systemic racism, is not abstract history. It is actually daily embodied reality. And I think you're just articulating it as well within the presentation. And you've also mentioned obviously that events like the Grenfell disaster, I can talk about the global Black Lives Matter situation that we've had recently, and some of the key areas that most of us probably will be familiar with from media, whether in the UK or indeed across the globe, are not just social or political events. And I think that's very, very important from what you've emphasized there. That they actually represent collective trauma. And it always begs us to think, definitely, should we actually be making sure that everyone is trauma informed in their practice, in their approach to everything that they do? Because that actually is some of the things that this work is bringing us to. But also, there's this ongoing marginalization, which is another key challenge, and as well as the struggle of recognition and justice. So these are really key things that will affect people from the global majority and or from racialized minorities. So these events, once again, they have direct implications for mental health and all these psychological presentations that our populations present with. Trust in institutions, trust even in our evidence-based interventions and our therapeutic relationships themselves. That actually questions that. So obviously, one of the things that stood out for me really, once again, just that constant reminder that therapy does not occur in a vacuum. Yes, we know standard CBT models often risk decontextualizing distress, focusing on individual cognitions and behavior, without examining that broader, socio, historical factors, that shape those experiences. And I think, that was some of the things when I was thinking about cultural adaptations, I was looking at that. Even though we think about, our current standard assessment frameworks, we need to be thinking the importance of socio-historical factors is important, because that's where actually you can understand about what are those historical factors that are important to the individual, and it's not something that you have to go and learn. You can actually elicit that from the assessment when you consider that when you're assessing someone, what are those socio-economic and indeed historical factors? And I think maybe that's one thing to add to psychological assessments. Socio-historical factors, explore that, ask the people about that, and see whether they will mention those key factors. And then you can consider whether there's something like you articulated today. So really, your presentation clearly argues that historical and cultural context, is not just an add-on; it is essential. Without it. And that's where I think for me, this is really, really quite important. And I'm always kind of moved by this. In psychology and CBT, we pride ourselves of case conceptualizations or formulations. We say, we cannot treat someone until we've got that working formulation or, But in essence, really, without it, our case conceptualizations may actually pathologize survival strategies, which is, then we engage into misinterpreting, mistrust, and or once again, which can result in resistance, and or we fail to validate the real roots of distress. That's really what ends up happening, especially for people from minoritized communities. When these things are either omitted or not even considered important, it just really traumatizes them. We always argue that, unlike medication, there's almost this assumption that, psychological interventions don't have side effects. They've got heterogenic side effects, risks which can impact the individual. So, and also just leading on to what you've just highlighted really clearly, is then, the need for cultural adapted perspective, the importance of integrating historical narratives into case formulations. And I loved your two exemplars that you shared, and really, and also even the exercise that you just gave around, the two differences in participants. And interestingly, this is not just about minoritized communities. You might be working with someone who's Irish right now, the Blood Sunday. You might be working with someone. So I think, once again, it's not just, obviously, yes, we're focusing on this group here because of a lot of issues that challenge them. But you can apply this with your indigenous populations as well. And I think that's very, very important. It's across cultures. And I think you've clearly brought that to mind. Once again, case formulations, it just doesn't become a tool for mapping our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, which sometimes, people just focus to that, but a shared narrative that, recognizes that intergenerational trauma, which everyone highlighted as a key theme in your Menti, but equally, we know that, systemic racism, cultural resilience, these are really key things that come up as well. And once again, understanding how trauma of slavery has shaped, once again, family narratives, and as well as how, the disaster still depends the feelings of invisibility amongst Black communities and others that are racially monetarized. So these are some of the key things that I think you really articulated. Once again, I appreciate the emphasis on practical strategies in your last slides. Really fantastic. What can people take from this? Really, how clinicians can, with sensitivity, inquire about historical experiences. You don't have to be a historian, probably like Alistair studied history. No. But actually, CBT and psychology empowers us to be curious and take an inquiry-based approach. And I think you really brought that home, that we need to explore those historical experiences. And actually, we can then determine, are they relevant to the individual presentation, or indeed are not. Obviously, we always also have to be mindful that, we are not self-indulging. I know everything about Greenfeld. I know, because that can also be challenging for our patients. But also, once again, using those open-ended cultural, whether you can attuned or questions, or that really facilitate us integrating this historical knowledge into the psychological formulations, but also into our psychoeducation as well, because this is what really will facilitate that bridge in gap in theory and practice, and avoid a more kind of tokenistic type, assessment, formulation, and history taking, which, patients will go, yeah, okay, but you're not asking me important things. Then they're not going to nudge you to actually ask them. They'll just say, well, you're not interested, because for them, it emphasizes the whole thing that, we are the colonized, the dominant force comes in and just detects what happens. People, it's only the very few that will step up and say no. So I think, once again, that's very important. And I guess, once again, you really hit out on the final implications for our healthcare systems. But I mean, widely for psychology, CBT practitioners, we should really ensure that this is not underestimated. We should promote more of this. I don't tend to think of these spaces as safe spaces, because I think there's never probably 100% safe space. I think more of them as psychologically brave spaces. If I'm brave to share, like you are brave to share about your history, your family history. Once again, and I think that's really important. That once again, you are a good example. I think you've got that mixed race parental background, yet your appearance doesn't, for someone that if was to judge you by your appearance, will come and actually say some racial stuff to you, thinking, well, you might align with them, when not realizing that there's some history behind. So I think that's a very, very powerful kind of example that you've given there. So I guess really, just in closing, really, I think, your presentation and what you're laying to us, is necessary to provoke us to think beyond what we will argue and say, yes, we do take history within CBT. Yes, we focus on the present, on the here and now, but we do assess history. But actually, you're bringing in the importance of the context and how we can utilize that to inform the intervention, but better understand someone's presentation as well, but also to move towards a more truly inclusive and effective psychological perspective, which actually I think, we must center history, not as a background, variable, because people always say ethnicity and other things are nuisance variables, but actually there are science, and history, is a very, very important variable. Individual's background, is also important because that is what then we live in that context. So no, really thank you for bringing that in, and I hope that this provokes us to really think about how we apply that historical assessment, not just as we've been doing, but really think about how this informs our better understanding of our patients and better formulating and also developing treatments that actually are effective. No, thank you for that.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you so much, Alistair, for your presentation. It really made me reflect about the interdisciplinary application as well. I'm a little bit unusual as a psychiatrist. I don't always prescribe medications, but when someone's been assessed, they've been fully assessed. And I think that sense of curiosity, that sense of who is this person? How do they function? Where are they from? What's their family like? And I mean, it's interesting that we spoke about murderous and marvelous, but also everyday lives. What are everyday lives like for these people? So I thought that was fantastic. We've got a couple of questions, and what I thought we could do is just hear the questions, and then if we have any time at the end, quite a few people have asked what your research will look like, but we'll just see how we go. First of all, I'm just going to ask Priya if she'd like to ask her question, or if she's happy for me to ask this one.
You can read it. It looks like Rebecca.
Okay, no problem. So this is from Priya. How do you encourage colleagues to be thinking in this way? I don't want to be the one teaching others about colonial history just because I am from an ethnic minority background.
I mean, I think we're still in the early days of actually kind of really raising this as an area. And I suppose I'd be thinking about, both one kind of asking the question, just pointing out, look, this is a gap. What when you're in a case discussion, I don't know what your context is, Priya, but or in context where you're kind of thinking about clients' backgrounds, what happened? What happens in a person's background? What's going on in there? What's going on in their society, their community at the time of when things developed? Is there an aspect to think about here? And also, I think maybe just pointing out the gaps too, kind of saying, oh, look, here's this potentially relevant information, but I can't, where do we put this in? And maybe I think also, it's a difficult thing maybe, but storytelling, I think that's a helpful way of putting it together so that you're kind of showing in a very clear, fluid way, like with the example of Hassan. If one of those historical events was relevant to him, I think you could tell a fairly clear story, couldn't you, about how that influenced the development of the PTSD. So I hope that kind of makes some kind of sense.
I mean, I think that's really interesting. And I think the interesting point in there is about being from an ethnic minority background. But I think almost what we're saying is historical context is important, but the fact of the matter is we're more aware of the historical context for some people rather than others. So it's sort of saying, actually, we just need to understand a bit more for those minority ethnicities. But no, that's a really helpful answer. The other question is from Gaia, and I will go ahead and read this question. How should psychological therapy address the nuanced experiences of racism versus colorism, particularly in cases where clients of colour differ in skin tone from family peers of the same ethnicity? In a globalised world, where terms like white passing are becoming more recognised, some individuals may carry shame, guilt, or confusion about their perceived privilege or exclusion. Should therapists proactively address these dynamics, risking appearing insensitive, or wait for the client to introduce the topic, even if that silence may reinforce feelings of isolation or invalidation?
Well, I mean, relating to historical context, I suppose one thing I would think about here is, say, thinking about a client from the Caribbean, thinking about a history of colorism in the Caribbean and how that, might affect that particular client, how that might make it particularly resonant in some ways, less resonant in others. I mean, it's a tricky one, but I think it is, as I think Peter was saying earlier, it is about us to raise it, and having to think quite carefully about how we do it, and that's a real therapeutic skill. Of course, it runs the risk of being insensitive, and that's entirely possible. And we probably will get it wrong at some points, but I think it's our job to raise these things rather than wait for the client to introduce the topic. I mean, I'd be curious about what Peter thinks about that, but that's my initial response.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, because it's almost like there's two bits in it. There's the bigger challenge of people being colorblind on the minoritized communities. Then now you've got, as you say, when someone is also then feeling shame or about their own ethnicities. But I guess from a whether a psychology or CBT point of view, we already have got the tools of addressing these things. And once again, our curiosity and exploring these things and really just I think it's always taking things at face value and labeling them and trying to understand what's going on for the individual. So I think those are things that are tools that we already have. So in a way, I think we just default to some of those key tools that we already have, being curious and actually exploring what this means for the individual. And then unpacking with the individual to make sense. I think oftentimes it's about trying to make sense with the individual and then look at how that fits into a wider formulation. Because oftentimes I think that's what makes people feel less likely to talk about these things, especially when they feel that their privileges. I know a lot of people struggle with what privileges, and actually they don't want even to talk about them. But part of that is our approach, I think, as colleagues, is that we take a more psychoeducational approach, and these forums are not about bashing, because this is not about bashing someone else. It's about how do we? It's something as with something, whether you're looking at racism and other things. It's how you engage someone into a conversation, how you guide or educate others. For some people, feel exhausted educating others because they feel that it's not their responsibility and role. But I think equally as a professional, if I feel that I've been talking about this for so many times, I don't want to, I can signpost you to where the resources are. Once again, because that also means you're looking after your own health and well-being. Or if I'm not the only Black or the only person to be talking about these things, it's how you do that in a more responsive way. Because it's being key. People are always keen to learn, and where people are keen to learn, do you have the resources, or is there a network that can facilitate that?
And there's just one more which we might have time for. We've just got 6 minutes left, but just a quick one. Thank you for your discussion. I appreciate your comment about incorporating historical context, not being confined to being trauma informed. To me, it resonates with the realm of being culturally competent and being part of a sound biopsychosocial framework and CBT formulation. As such, what avenues do you see as the priorities for building the process metacompetencies you mentioned? Reviewing training curricula, clinical supervision, or continuing professional development? And that is from Katia.
Yeah, and I could also see the hello from Trinidad and Tobago message, so that's nice. I mean, I'm going to start by hedging it and saying that I think more research is needed. There's been very little done in this area, and that's what I'm going to be doing. Hopefully, if I can get some funding to follow this further down. I think it's part of getting a clearer, stronger voice from clients and communities about what they want. so that we can get so we can say with more authority to therapists and systems that this is important, this is something that needs to be followed up on. Building the meta competencies, I do think that one thing that could be done more of is finding the particular competency niche that this fits into, so that you can, it's not a kind of general a general encouragement, but it's actually something that sits within, say, something like the UCL CBT competencies, that fits within professional frameworks like BABCP minimum training standards, all that kind of thing. And I don't see it as a million miles away from there. I mean, the UCL competencies, part of it talks about being able to appreciate the client's worldview or something like that. I would argue that being able to address historical context of the client makes it more likely that you're going to appreciate their worldview. So I would argue that this is kind of, it's not replacing anything or like kind of sitting off in some different area. It's sitting very much in the core of what we do as therapists. The core, as I think Peter brought up really nicely earlier, the core of what we do as therapists is being able to sit down with people and engage them, to ask the appropriate questions so that we can kind of do a fuller assessment, build up a formulation, a shared understanding together, and gain their trust. And then hopefully, repay them for that, so show that they were right to trust us. And I think that there's something there about, kind of working through that process of fitting it in with what we are already totally accepted standard competencies across psychological therapy and CBT, not just specifically look at the EDI area, across the entire piece, that we could build this into there so that then it's kind of obvious in a way. Of course you do this, because if you didn't, then how are you going to do your job properly? If that's not, yeah.
Thank you, Alistair. Unfortunately, we don't have time to come back to Peter because we've only got 2 minutes before the end of the webinar. But just to wrap up, we've had lots of positive comments, lots of food for thought on the chat. I think lots of people are interested in hearing more about your research, Alistair, as well. So that's really exciting. Just also to let people know, we have a Chimes seminar mailing list if people want to be kept informed of upcoming webinars. I think this should be posted on the chat as well. And I would just like to thank everyone very much for coming, and a very massive thank you to Alistair and to Peter. And yeah, just in closing, I think there was some really nice messages from people just saying what an enriching presentation it was, and how insightful it was, and how people will find it useful to use in their clinical practice. So thanks very much, everybody. And I think we're ready to close. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to see everyone here.